Uh, he is truly a remarkable person. Ken Cuccinelli was first elected to the Virginia State Senate in August of 2002 in a special election. His experience as an accomplished attorney uniquely prepared him for his role in the General Assembly, where he serves on the influential Senate Courts of Justice Committee. Senator Cuccinelli also serves on the Transportation Committee, the Local Government Committee, and the Rehabilitation and Social Services Committee. As a legislator, Ken Cuccinelli has made the interests of working families his top priority. He fights for better roads, low taxes, and improving education. He worked with local advocacy groups to increase Virginia funds available to support individuals with mental retardation and developmental disabilities in Northern Virginia. Ken also has a strong record of supporting our police officers as they protect our communities. Last year, Ken's successful eminent domain legislation stopped local and state governments from taking private homes and businesses for developers' projects rather than for truly public purposes. Ken is a leading voice for protecting and advancing America's foundational principles. He led the fight to defend constitutional rights, stop tax increases, protect life and families, and keep Virginia a low-regulation, pro-business state. He earned a mechanical engineering degree from the University of Virginia, and then a law degree and a master's degree from George Mason University. When that special Senate, state Senate election came up in the summer of 2002, there were two candidates for the Republican nomination. One of them, a fellow that I and my wife had known for more than 30 years, and the fellow that we didn't know at all, whose name was Ken Cuccinelli. So Helen and I supported this guy who was reasonably conservative and had been a friend of ours for a long time, and we worked at it rather vigorously. In fact, Helen was working the polls in behalf of Ken Cuccinelli's opponent at the firehouse primary where the votes were, and she gave me the word during the course of that day that this fellow Ken Cuccinelli, whom we didn't know or had just barely met, was going to be the nominee, and a whole lot of very good people, just our kind of people, were there voting for Ken Cuccinelli. Well, he won the nomination, and he won the election, and has since won a re-election campaign. He's the only Republican state senator now representing Northern Virginia in the General Assembly in Richmond. This man is a principled conservative. This man has won my admiration from the very start, as he will tell you. I have been a very strong supporter of his personally ever since. Of course, the Leadership Institute is a nonpartisan organization, but you don't lose your civil rights when you go to work for an educational foundation. In case you didn't hear that, Ken said, yet. That could be during the Clinton administration. The Leadership Institute and many other conservative nonprofits were savagely audited by the Clinton administration's Internal Revenue Service. They found nothing wrong that, as far as I know, any group had done, but it was a 3.5-year ordeal, several sets of obnoxious fishing expedition questions, uncounted man-hours of my staff answering the IRS questions from a series of 4 different IRS agents who obviously declined in IQ as they made change after change. And at the end, after $70,000 of lawyers' fees and all of that expense, we got our letter saying that our tax status was secure. They never, ever found a single thing to question. about what we had done. And this may resume in the new administration. As I said earlier, we shall see. Conservatives now, obviously, starting today, are going to have to start over. But we're not going to start from scratch, because there has been a substantial base of conservatives that has been built up over the years. And I am here to tell you that in my observations of Ken Cuccinelli, there is currently no one else in the Commonwealth of Virginia who has been as dedicated and as successful at the job of identifying conservatives, recruiting them, and organizing them in Virginia, thereby significantly increasing the number and the effectiveness of conservative activists. I consider this gentleman a rising star for conservatives, and I'm honored that he got up this morning after what had to have been a long night, to address us. I present to you with great pleasure Ken Cuccinelli.
Well, good morning. Well, morning. Days like last night are ones you don't want to see in politics, but the fact of the matter is we had this coming. And we don't have to look across the aisle to see where the fault lies. By way of introduction, Morton told you a bit about me. I did grow up in Northern Virginia, which makes me something of an anomaly around here, and have lived here my whole life. And as Morton also mentioned, I'm the only Republican state senator left in Northern Virginia out of about 2 million people. I was watching with particular interest last night the county-by-county map, and I haven't seen the numbers this morning, but I understand as of last night that all 9 Northern Virginia localities went for Obama. Not something that I was happy to see, particularly with respect to Prince William County and Manassas and Loudoun. We have succeeded in Northern Virginia where others have failed by doing what Morton told you, is we have gone out and found people who agree with us and brought them out. We have also turned independent and Democrat votes by explaining why our message is good for them, their families, and their community. And I look to Reagan's performance as our model. We don't go and ask people to become Republicans. We go and ask them to join us in advancing issue by issue a conservative agenda. And in my district, which includes places like Burke and Fair Oaks that are not at all Republican, we have prevailed 3 times. After that special election Morton mentioned to you, we ran the opposition to the sales tax referendum in Northern Virginia out of our House. My wife appreciated that. 3 elections in 4 months run out of the House. But we beat that by 10 points, 55-45, being outspent 12-1. In our special election, we won by 10 points, being outspent 2.5-1. I have yet to outspend an opponent, but I have yet to lose to an opponent either. So we've been outspent in every race, but we've never been outworked, and we have never backed off our conservative principles. And that is critical to getting those volunteers you heard Morton mention. People power is real, it's out there, and frankly, in this election, it was used against us. And it was used against us because we abandoned our principles as a party. So, not all of us, obviously, but we became prostitutes to power. It became power, not principle. And it actually became power to hold office, and it cost us office. We are no longer in the majority in 2006. Obviously, that happened. We got further wiped out last night. And that is largely because we failed to perform. I think you can look back through the last 28 years and say that in 1980 we built a house of bricks. And even a house of bricks has a chimney in it. A Sandra Day O'Connor gets down there once in a while. Things like that happen. but it was a house of bricks. In 1994, we built a house of sticks, and we watched as it was sold as something it wasn't, and that was the beginning of the abandonment of principle, perhaps a year or two after that election. And in 2000, we built a house of straw. And, you know, myself and many others who thought of the junior George Bush as more akin to Ronald Reagan than to his father learned that we were wrong. And in 2008, the wind blew, and it didn't take a whole lot. As it happens, they brought a pretty strong wind. You have to give the other side credit for what they have accomplished. They put together a substantial organization at a fairly low level. The most impressive numbers there are the raw number of donors that participated in the Obama campaign. In my races, we have had a similar performance within the state, nothing on that kind of scale, but in my last election, we had 3 times as many small donors as the next largest legislative campaign in the state. We had 140 elections. We had 3 times as many $100 or under donors as anyone else in Virginia. We had 1/6 as many as the governor. And the reason for that is we have buy-in from people at the ground level on the core principles. And for me, the core principles can be found in that famous sentence of the Declaration of Independence. You gotta flip pursuit of happiness to property. But in my mind, and in my vision for the Republican Party, that defines not only what we ought to be, but the limit of what we ought to be. And the next sentence, after life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, not as famous, is for these purposes governments are instituted among men. We've forgotten why governments were instituted among men. It's interesting, we're standing in Jim Moran's district, and yesterday he's so useful for quotes. You know, he's just incredible. He makes Joe Biden look boring. And yesterday's, and I won't get it exactly right, was something like, you know, we've finally outgrown the 7 years of this simplistic notion that people who create wealth have some right to keep it. You know, there's so many things I could say about that. But let me just ask you, and I don't need to answer the question, what would the Founding Fathers think about that simplistic notion of a simplistic notion? You know, that isn't what they fought against specifically, but to them taxes were a property issue. Property rights went beyond what we think of it now as. We talked eminent domain and the power to take property. But your earnings are yours. And I share that simplistic notion that they are yours. Now, one difference between those of us in state government and those in federal government, especially in the last few years, is in state government we have balanced budget requirements. We don't get to just swipe my kid's credit card to do what we want to do. And you know, the biggest clue that we had gone astray over the last few years was the complete abandonment of spending restraint. As Senator McCain, I recall hearing him saying that Republicans were spending like drunken sailors is offensive to drunken sailors. And the reality is we need to rein in government in all respects. All respects. You can't spend 15% more than you're taking in and expect to make that up. Again, in state government, we don't have that luxury. But at the federal level, our Republican Congress was running up the debt to an extraordinary degree and to no principled purpose. If you look back to Reagan, Reagan had something in mind. He was going to bankrupt the Soviet Union. He's going to do it with the defense buildup. He's going to do it with SDI, and he did it. Now that is an investment worth making. What we're spending our money on today is not anywhere near what Ronald Reagan had in mind. And unfortunately, if you're an average voter and you think that the Republicans are supposed to be the ones who keep government small and off your back, and they're the ones growing it faster than anyone ever has before, well, why vote for that? You can vote for a Democrat and get that. And they tell you they're going to do it. Well, most of them. Most of them. One thing that we have in Virginia that is unique is these odd year elections. I'm running for Attorney General in 2009. Our whole statewide ticket is up. Only New Jersey has their statewide offices up in 2009, aside from Virginia. And what we found in Virginia is that when we get by these presidential elections, the slate is, to a certain degree, wiped clean. We're starting with a new one. And I agree with Morton that we are now in a rebuilding phase as conservatives, but we're not starting from scratch. I would tell you, though, that the first contest is not the elections in November of 2009. It's the wrestling match now for the reconstruction of the Republican Party. And that is a fight we have got to take on head on. And let me tell you a little bit about my experience doing that. The Virginia State Senate is a liberal body, for those of you that don't know our state politics. When we had a Republican majority, it was a liberal Republican majority. They, along with Mark Warner, gave you the largest tax increase in Virginia history. They made Mark Warner U.S. Senator. They did it. Republicans in the Virginia State Senate, our leadership, in its finite wisdom, decided that government wasn't big enough in Virginia. And they came up with all sorts of interesting names. The communication strategy here is all very interesting. We're reforming government. We're reforming it bigger, of course. Restructuring, that's another good one. But when I bring bills in to move dollars from one part of the budget to the other, which I would consider restructuring, those don't get out of the Finance Committee. So when they say restructuring, they mean more money from you. I remember famously watching Jesse Ventura when he was running for governor against Hubert Humphrey III and a Republican whose name I don't remember. In 1999, I was channel surfing and I caught their debate. And Jesse Ventura is 6'6", 300 pounds. I mean, just sitting down, he blocks out the sun. And he was on the far right of this particular debate. And I remember that Humphrey was on the left, the Republican was in the middle. And Humphrey said something about investment. And Ventura immediately interrupted him, leaned across the Republican, who you could no longer see, and grabbed his back pocket and pointed at Humphreys and said, "When you say investment, I reach for my wallet." And I have never forgotten that line, because I have heard you can replace the word investment with reform, restructuring, a million things, depending on the year, and it's all about your wallet. And the Democrats have no aversion to drill, the ones who just got elected, but they're going to drill in your wallet. They're not going to drill offshore. And we're going to see a major push for tax increases. They're going to let the tax cuts expire. Frankly, I think we're going to, unfortunately, not be performing very well as a nation economically in coming years. I would be remiss, since I see Mark Mix here, to also comment that part of the problem there is going to be the union legislation that we're going to see. Virginia is, on the East Coast, the northernmost right-to-work state, and I think we're going to see that under assault. One of the things the next Attorney General is going to deal with in Virginia is essentially fighting with the federal government over maintaining our right-to-work status. This is not something that gets talked about a lot out in campaigns, because a lot of people, first of all, in Virginia, it's taken for granted. Second of all, a lot of people don't know what it is. I'm assuming everybody here does know what it is. It's hard to then address that issue publicly when you've got to start from scratch educating people. But we need to do that. And we have won our elections on the ground in our 200,000 person Senate district by educating people on these issues one at a time on their doorstep. I can't tell you how many people I saw at the polls yesterday who, and it's a little embarrassing as an elected official, you know, I don't remember everybody that I meet. I wish I had that skill. But dozens of people said, oh, yeah, you came to my door. You came to my door. And those doors, one at a time over 6 years, are how we turn independents, it's how we turn Democrats to the right message. I mean, folks, we do not need to be afraid of our message. Life begins at conception. Taxes are high enough. Spending and government power in general needs to be reined in. The Second Amendment is a good thing. It's a good thing, even in Fairfax County. You know, a lot of the Democrats I deal with would like to read it right out of the Constitution. Of course, they'd like to read a lot of things right out of the Constitution, but the Second Amendment is high on their list. And, you know, it takes some explaining on an emotional issue to folks about why it is good for them, even if they don't own a gun, even if they don't want to own a gun, and how it serves the interests of America and their community, day in, day out. Property rights. We no longer have them in the federal Constitution. The Kelo decision wiped them out. They're gone. You don't even have to go to law school to be able to figure out a way to legitimize any taking whatsoever under Kelo. The only protection we have left is in our states. One of my proudest accomplishments is the 3-year fight to get eminent domain protection in Virginia. It took 3 years. It's amazing. It's still just legislation. In the state where Patrick Henry and George Mason voted against the U.S. Constitution in convention because it didn't protect exactly these kinds of rights, we don't have it in our Constitution here in Virginia. It's appalling. And it's certainly one of the things I'll continue to work on as Attorney General. On the, in addition to what I think will be some union-based battles with the federal government, another significant contest that the next Attorney General is going to take on in Virginia is the marriage amendment. Virginia had one of the toughest in the country, and we passed it 57-43. But the fact of the matter is, other states are going in a different direction. And I believe that we're going to see an invasion from one of those states of plaintiffs who are going to land us in federal court. That decision is going to go to the Supreme Court. That's really where it's going to be decided. And the next Attorney General is either going to fight it or not. My likely Democrat opponent voted with us on the marriage amendment, and then when his MoveOn.org base pressured him during the campaign for the amendment, he flipped. So that's the commitment we get on the other side. And frankly, that was before the left is really feeling their oats. And you can just imagine, they're sleeping in today, but they're going to get up with a sense of entitlement that's a little bit different than the one that we often talk about when it comes to policy. And they're going to push very hard on all these things, and they're going to expect to win. And I think you can expect to see reflected a rather dramatic difference in the type of Democrat Party that we're contending with now. We see it in Virginia, and I think we're seeing it nationally, but we have never seen it ascendant as it is now. If you go back to 1976, which in terms of sort of political development is where I think of us as being back to, that's the closest analogy to where we are here. But there were a lot of Democrats in Congress who would support things like the Hyde Amendment and who were pro-life Democrats. They were socially conservative to some degree or another that we wouldn't recognize today. Well, not anymore. Today's Democrat, average Democrat, is a socialist. And let's call it what it is. Now, reflecting back on my initial premise that the problem resides with us, when we propose a $700 billion bailout of capitalism by government, and when we add the biggest health care entitlement in the history of America, we are standing on sand to criticize the other side. We are not in a good position to do that. Unfortunately, we have given away our credibility, and we've got to get it back. That means leadership change. That means a new minority leader on Capitol Hill. Let's face it, folks. If we don't get back to core principles and have leaders who are willing to fight, instead of get up there and say, I didn't come here to do this, I'm going to eat this mud sandwich of socialism, you have an option. It's the red button on your desk. It's the only time I think of myself as red, is voting time. But there's a time for no. Conservatives always have to be cognizant of bringing a positive alternative. But you know what? There were plenty of conservatives on Capitol Hill who proposed, I recall reading over 10 positive alternatives to the bailout, which wouldn't have required taxpayer dollars, such as we saw with the ultimate bailout. That was a horrible, horrible piece of legislation. And as we hand over the administration from Bush to Obama, the people in control of that process, and if you've read the bill, I'm enough of a wonk that I read a lot of these bills, the power given to the Treasury Department is extraordinary in that bill. And I just got an email from Capital One, a Virginia company that really wasn't touched by the mortgage problems. They didn't do mortgages. Capital One does unsecured loans. Sounds fairly risky. But it was interesting in talking to them, unsecured loans, where they had done an analysis of the borrower, were safer to them than home loans under the environment that had been set up. Which I thought was, frankly, pretty savvy from a business perspective. They weren't the only ones to draw that conclusion. They weren't the only ones to just get lucky and do that. So they were on a fine footing from a capital perspective. Well, you know what? Last week I got an email that they took $3.5 billion of government investment. Why? There's no good reason. You need to stabilize Capital One. They were fine. That's how bad that bill was. And that's how weak our credibility is in terms of addressing these issues. As we go forward, we have literally got to be pretty strict internally in reestablishing the focus of the Republican Party on conservative core principles. That doesn't mean there's no room for anybody else. It doesn't mean you have to agree on every single issue, but you've certainly got to be committed to reining in government and reducing the power of government. That means keeping taxes low, but it also means keeping spending low. And until we're committed to doing that, until we're committed again to protecting the Constitution, we are not going to be a legitimate alternative force in American politics. Now, what I'll tell you about my race for Attorney General is I have led on the Second Amendment. I have led on property rights. I have led in fighting taxes, not always successfully, and spending. I'm the only state senator who's proposed more cuts than spending every single year he's been in the Senate. Every single year. I was one of only 2 legislators to campaign for the marriage amendment in Northern Virginia, not the friendliest territory in Virginia, for that. And I'm the only conservative, certainly, in the state Senate and Republican at all, that's been able to win in Northern Virginia in the face of what is viewed as a Democrat tide. And there's some truth to that, but some of it is we have beaten ourselves. The Virginia State Senate did the same thing that Republicans on Capitol Hill did. You know, when we raised taxes, why vote Republican? And we lost 2 incumbents in the last election cycle last year, leaving me as the only Republican in Northern Virginia in the state Senate. It's true at the state level, it's true at the federal level. And what I seek to do as I go around Virginia is impart a vision for not only Virginia, but for the Republican Party. I believe there are steps to this. I believe that the conservative agenda has to be generally readopted by the Republican Party, and that isn't something that you just go ask people to do. You've got to go fight for it. You've got to win votes. You've got to win them at local elections. You've got to win them at state level, and you've got to then advance the agenda. No one person can move this agenda forward. It's why I appreciate the Wednesday morning networking that goes on here at LI and everything else that LI does. Is none of us, if one of us was made president tomorrow, could we advance the conservative agenda without an awful lot of help. One of the advantages I bring to an election like this, where part of the fight is redefining the Republican Party, is I'm willing to lose. I am perfectly willing to lose. I like going home. If people want to send me home, I am happy to go there. From my perspective, we put it on the table, we argue our issues, and then we learn what God has in mind for us. It's His plan, and the good news is we all know how this ends. We just don't know how we get there. He does. He does. But I believe we have a duty to fight all the way to that point. And I believe that the Founding Fathers need to recognize the platform that we're fighting for, the precepts that we're fighting for. And there's no place better to get back to that foundation than the Commonwealth of Virginia. America is going to be watching Virginia in 2009. If for no other reason, then there's nothing else going on. Yeah, except New Jersey, and we'll see if they count much. But I was born in New Jersey. I joke with people that I legally immigrated to Virginia when I was 2. And I've stayed here ever since. But the Italian side comes from up there. They're the only other races this year. There are people up there that hope Steve Lonigan will be competitive. I don't know how far gone New Jersey is, but we will see. But Virginia is going to be competitive for all 3 statewide offices, and we're going to have a real fight this year about who our nominees are going to be. My 2 competitors for the Attorney General nomination both declare themselves to be conservatives. Everybody does in Republican nominations. There's only one time that all 3 of us made not the same decision, had to consider the same political decision at the same time. And that was the 1996 Republican primary between John Warner and Jim Miller. Jim Miller of Reagan budget fame was the conservative in that race, and I supported Jim in that race, and both my opponents are publicly on record as having supported John Warner. So I'm running against 2 John Warner conservatives. And that's the only single point where all 3 of us had to make the same decision over many years of campaigning and participation. So that's the choice we have in Virginia. It may be the only nomination contest. There doesn't look like anybody's going to challenge Bob McDonnell for governor within the party. There may be a challenge to Bill Bolling, I don't know yet, but I'm not sure that'll get off the ground anyway, which means that the Attorney General race in convention on May 30th, 2009, is going to be the first step to redefining the Republican Party, not only in Virginia, but we get to go first for America. I hope, obviously I have a personal interest in hoping that we make a conservative choice. It's a little awkward campaigning to this day because you're selling yourself, and that's still not entirely comfortable to me, but I will tell you this, and I'll give you one example. The Second Amendment. In my district, the Second Amendment polls were 4-1 for gun control. And upon my arrival in the Senate, I was the leader on the Second Amendment. Of course, you're all familiar with the tragedy of Virginia Tech last year. That shooter was from my district, and we had 2 victims' families from my district. That is still a very raw, emotional situation in my district. The year before that, we had the Sully Police Station shooting, which some of you may recall. 2 police officers were shot and killed. That was my police station. I'm now friends with both those families, but Mike Garbarino, one of the officers, killed there, lived in my neighborhood, and was a good friend of mine. That shooter was from my district. I ran for re-election last year, and with all of that circulating around in a lousy year for Republicans, in a tough district, and I represent people from Fairfax County only. I don't even get Prince William or Loudoun precincts to enjoy as a Republican. And on the toughest issue in that district, I didn't give 1 inch. And you can imagine what the political mail looked like last year on that issue. It was very inflammatory, very emotional. I was very sensitive, and that's not a word I use often. I was very sensitive to the emotions in my district for very good reason. There were people who lost children, who lost siblings, friends recently, and they had very raw reaction politically to what I had to offer. but we didn't back off 1 inch. I've been involved in elections for 17 years, and I've never seen a situation like that for any candidate I've ever worked with. And I hope I never do again, and I certainly hope it's not me as the candidate. But you all know, and so does everybody else now, that under those most difficult of circumstances, I won't back off 1 inch on issues of principle. The same is true of life. I'm the only life begins at conception, bar none, person in my election contest. I've also got a record on fighting taxes and spending that nobody else has in this race. These are things that a lot of people view as too hard positions. We really need to move more to the middle. We need to capture the folks in the middle. You know what? We capture the folks in the middle, and we do it by explaining to them why conservative principles are good for them, their family, and their community. That's how you capture the middle. And without exception, that's how you build a party, that's how you build a community and a political movement that can once again govern America in a way that's worth governing. Having majorities is useless without them being principled majorities. And that is my long-term goal for the conservative movement, for the Republican Party of Virginia, and I hope for the Republican Party across America. And I'm also hopeful, and frankly somewhat honored, to be in a position to take the first step down that road. And that's what we're going to do. We may not win, but I hope that we'll have all of y'all's support, your prayers. We have my wife works harder than I do in all this, so pray for her more than me. But and we're expecting our 7th in April, so we'll get our majority one way or the other. So, and it is wonderful, but it is challenging. She gives up a lot for this, but we share these core principles, and there's something we believe in, and we wouldn't do this. And it's also why I'm willing to lose, because I really do like going home. And if I'm not down there, and if we're not sacrificing for a reason that means something, then we're not going to do it. Anyway, that is how I view where we are now, the day after, and that's how I view our way out. And I haven't spoken to you about any other states. I think that Virginia needs to set an example. And if we set a winning example, other states will follow it. They will follow it. But we need to make sure we get it right here first, because we are first. And there's no place more appropriate, given American history, than to start rebuilding a real conservative democracy that the Founding Fathers would recognize right here in Virginia, and I'd appreciate all of y'all's help to do that. And thank you all very much. God bless you, and God bless America. We need it. So you want me to take questions? If there's a question or two, be happy. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I'm sorry. They're going to pass a mic around to you.
This has been the most expensive election procedure in our nation's history. It's obscene. What is your position on nationally funded campaigns, and what procedure would you initiate?
In Virginia, we have disclosure rules, and then there are no limits and corporations can give. And when, I'll use an example, in the sales tax referendum in 2002, developers, God bless them, were putting in over 40% of the money to try and get that tax increase. Well, that wasn't because of any reason of principle. That was an investment. That was so all of us in this room and everybody else in Northern Virginia could pay our tax dollars to make their land investment more valuable. And we used that against them with tremendous effect over the internet, through email, and in free media, frankly. I believe in disclosure. I do not believe in McCain-Feingold type of campaign finance regulation. It diminishes freedom, and it reduces, and it inhibits our ability to fight back. And it's interesting, I didn't read in one single newspaper or in any mainstream media position that the first campaign promise that Barack Obama broke was to take public financing. Now, He went on to break all kinds of records in raising money, but it is rather blithely accepted that he didn't tell the truth. Well, you know, on to the next one. And there were no consequences for that. And for all the money that's spent, this was still a relatively close race if you look at it state by state. Had we, and I'm speaking to you as someone who's been outspent in every single race, including the nomination Morton mentioned, and I had another nomination contest. We've been outspent in every single race. But you know what, folks? We are right. We are right. And that is a very powerful tool in a campaign, if you're not embarrassed of it. Yeah, I'm pro-life, but don't hold that against me. You know, how often have you seen that? The answer is, yeah, I'm pro-life. When do you think life begins? Well, give me another question. You know, they won't answer it. Every liberal position is based on a fallacious argument. They cannot stand for debate. They can't stand for it because they're wrong on every issue if you boil it down. But we have to have the guts to push and push and push and get down to that bottom layer. So, yeah.
We have some more. Scott McGarry?
While Scott's getting the mic, there are petitions going around to get me on the ballot. I would appreciate it if those of you from Virginia would sign these before they go. Shack Hill has them, and also some literature went around. Emmett, do you have them as well? Okay, got some back there as well. We need to get about 6,000 of these, so in 3 weeks. So we'd appreciate your help. Sorry, Scott.
That's all right, thanks. As one who's in Richmond every day of every session since you've been there, I can certainly say that I've